Just about every student looks forward to spring break. The weather is just starting to really warm up in most places across the country, and school is out for a week or so. As tradition suggests, college kids are meant to ditch their dorms and head off to a beach under the sun. Partying rules the day and the night. Many students make lifetime memories of hanging out with friends and enjoying the atmosphere without a care in the world. But there's a dark side to all that time in the sun, too. Predators prey on students, especially young women. Although the chances of coming across a stone-cold killer are relatively slim, the worst stories are the stuff of nightmares. In today's episode, we will look into 3 stories of college students' spring break mysteries. And to make things darker, to this day, no one can explain what happened to these victims. Sarah Ann Ottens grew up in the small town of Morrison, Illinois. The oldest of 5 siblings, she was naturally outgoing and friendly with a good sense of humor. Sarah was well-liked at Morrison High School and involved in several extracurricular activities including theater, yearbook, and radio. After graduating from high school in 1971, Sarah started her college career at St. Francis School of Nursing in Peoria, Illinois, before relocating to the University of Iowa for her sophomore year. While she studied nursing, Sarah had a part-time job at the university hospital cafeteria. Sarah lived in Renow Hall, a co-ed dormitory that housed about 500 students, located on the western side of the campus. Renow Hall was first constructed as a men's dormitory in 1966, but became co-ed just 3 years before Sarah moved in. Sarah made many friends in Renow Hall. Though she lived in room 408, she often spent most of her time with her friends Kathleen and Margaret in room 429. The week of March 12th through 17th, 1973 was spring break at the University of Iowa. So many students were on vacation or back home with their families. The campus was a ghost town. Almost a third of the Iowa city's population left town for the week. The city was notably deserted. Sarah's friends Kathleen and Margaret, along with 2 other girls who lived in Renow Hall, went down to Florida for spring break that week. She was supposed to go with them, but instead decided to stay behind to make some extra money at work and visit her parents in Illinois. She did, however, agree to watch their cats and collect the mail. Her parents planned to pick her up and take her home to Illinois after her shift on Wednesday the 14th. On Tuesday, March 13th, Sarah completed her shift at the cafeteria at 2 p.m. and walked back to her dorm at Renow Hall. Once there, she picked up the mail. She then helped her friend Brenda, who had just returned from a weekend trip, bring her bags up to her room. After helping Brenda, Sarah took the elevator to the basement to get cigarettes from a vending machine before returning to the 4th floor. A few hours later, Brenda and her boyfriend George returned to her room after seeing a movie together. While George made them a snack, Brenda decided to go down to Sarah's room to see if she wanted to join them, seeing she was the only other person left on their floor that week. As she walked down the hall to room 429, she could hear what sounded like agitated cats. She then knocked on Sarah's door but got no answer. She tried to open the door, which, to her surprise, was unlocked. Once inside, the 2 cats Sarah was watching, Lucretia and Sammy, were inconsolable, yowling loudly while pacing the room. Brenda's eyes continued to scan the room and eventually discovered Sarah lying face down in the middle of the floor with a clean bedsheet covering her. In a panic, Brenda ran back to her room to get George, who ran down the hall immediately to check for a pulse. When he removed the sheet from Sarah's body, she was nude from the waist down, with the rest of her clothes scattered around the room. Her face and hair appeared to be damp, and bruises covered her body. Her green blouse was torn and soaked with blood. George realized there was no helping Sarah. She was dead. The coroner's report listed Sarah's official cause of death as asphyxiation. The medical examiner believed the murderer held something against her throat, possibly a broom. While there was no evidence of sexual assault, Sarah was violated with a broomstick after her death, with fecal matter found on her upper lip. The room was relatively clean, aside from the mixture of blood and water in the sink and small drop of blood on the carpet. Investigators found 2 fingerprints on the sink faucet. 6 months after Sarah's death, James Wendell Hall was charged with her murder. James was a sophomore at the university and a member of the football team. He lived on the first floor of Slater Hall, which was located right across the street from Reno Hall. During the trial, it was noted that the room where Sarah died was in clear view of James's room across the street, and their dorms actually faced each other. The thumbprint on the sink faucet matched James's, hair consistent with Sarah's was found on one of his shoes, and a hair consistent with his was found on her blouse. Investigators found some of Sarah's personal belongings and clothing, which had bloodstains on them, in James's dorm room. Additionally, 2 witnesses placed James in Reno Hall at the time of the murder. Ernest, a friend of James who lived on the 7th floor of Reno Hall, testified that James called him at about 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, asking to let him into the dorm, which was locked after certain hours. Although James proclaimed his innocence, as he said he was downtown the night Sarah died, investigators did not believe him. James was ultimately found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sent to jail and expected to live out his life there. However, he only spent 7 years in prison until November 1983, when a judge ruled that he had an unfair trial and released him. James was even rewarded $60,000 after settling a lawsuit with the prosecutor's office. Defense attorneys appealed the verdict and found prosecutors withheld key evidence at James's trial. Prosecutors also claimed during the trial that James's fingerprints were found at the scene, but never entered any evidence into court to prove it. Police detectives also came under fire for lying about how witnesses supposedly picked him out of a police lineup, even though they hadn't. James's story did not end there, though. Just 10 years after his release from prison in 1993, James was convicted for the murder of Susan Hodgeck and sentenced to life in prison. He is currently incarcerated in Des Moines. The murder of Sarah Ann Ottens is officially unsolved, although many believe James had something to do with it. It is still unclear what happened to her on March 13, 1973, and why. Back in 1994, then 21-year-old Amy Gellert had seemingly gotten her life back on track. The young girl had overcome quite a few challenges. At the age of 3, her parents divorced, and Amy and her 2 older brothers, Mark and Ryan, moved with her mom, Bunny, to Cocoa Beach, Florida. 2 years later, Bunny married Bob Letton, who ultimately had become a great father figure in Bunny's children's lives. However, not long after, Amy's life changed drastically when she became severely ill with encephalitis that left her with learning disabilities. The disabilities she developed changed a lot of things in her life and even caused her to be held back a grade. Despite her past struggles, by freshman year in high school, Amy had become somewhat of a typical teenager. She was rebelling against her mom and stepfather as well, started experimenting with drugs. Eventually, she unfortunately developed a substance abuse problem and was admitted to a rehab program located in Orlando, Florida. In 1992, Amy returned home, seemingly a new person. She was refocused, and now instead of desiring to party, she was ready to head to college, had gotten a new group of friends, and even devoted herself to her local church, where she would work from time to time. Sadly, Amy would face yet another tragedy. On March 20th, 1994, Amy was home from school on spring break, and her plan was to settle in for a quiet week at home with her parents, rather than spend spring break partying with friends. So, Bunny, Bob, and Amy decided they would attend an evening church service together. Amy was in charge of operating the soundboard during services, so had to stay after it ended to make sure everything was put away properly, and assured her parents she would be home soon. The couple said their goodbyes, then left the church and headed home. Bob and Bunny Letton walked into their quiet home in the beachside town of Cocoa Beach, Florida. As they closed the door behind them, a man emerged into the room. He was wearing all black except for white tennis shoes, black leather gloves, and a ski mask covering his face. He was also holding a gun and a dagger that was excessively decorated with a gold chain that was interwoven around the handle. The intruder instructed the couple to crawl on their hands and knees from the kitchen to the living room and then demanded them to lie face down on the floor. Bob was instructed to lie down first, and then Bunny to lie on her stomach across the small of her husband's back. What almost seemed like just an afterthought to the intruder, he suddenly asked where he could find anything of value. Bob directed him to where he could take the little cash and credit cards they had in the home. Not seeming satisfied, the couple offered the jewelry Bunny was wearing that was worth over $5,000 and their cars. However, when he did not accept them, it was becoming clear that robbery was not his primary motive. Instead, for the next 30 minutes he began to pace back and forth in the living room while occasionally glancing at the clock. Bob and Bunny weren't sure what to think. Although he never loosened the grip on his weapons, he wasn't being overtly hostile. He just kept them hostage, not engaging with them at all. Suddenly, Bunny felt a wave of dread come over her as headlights coming down the driveway beamed into a nearby window. Amy was home from church. Startled by the headlights outside, the intruder panicked and started brutally stabbing the couple. First, he sliced Bunny across the neck and then stabbed her numerous times in the lower back with the dagger. He turned and stabbed Bob once in the back of the head. Terrified that Amy was about to walk in and become a third victim, Bob staggered to his feet and managed to make his way out the front door. He raced outside, yelling for Amy to run and get help. Sadly, the intruder was only a few steps behind him. He burst out of the front door and immediately began attacking Amy as she got out of her car. Amy tried to shield herself with a knapsack she was carrying, but the cloth bag was no help. He stabbed her over and over in the head and neck. However, he must have realized that Amy's screams were likely to attract attention because just as suddenly as the attack started, it was over. The man raced off down the street and disappeared into the darkness. Amy stumbled across the street to the parking lot of an apartment complex, where she begged a woman to call for help. Gasping for air, she told the woman she had been stabbed, then collapsed to the ground. The woman yelled for someone to call 911, then tried to comfort Amy, but it was no use. Amy was dead. Police were at the scene within minutes, and Bob and Bunny were rushed to the hospital where they would spend weeks recovering from their injuries. Investigators were stunned by Amy's murder, as the murder had taken place in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. They struggled to determine the motive behind the vicious attack, which seemed to have occurred at random. Although the killer had spent a substantial amount of time in the home, he left no trace of himself behind. The police had no description, fingerprints, or DNA to work with. However, outside, lying near the blue knapsack Amy used in an attempt to shield herself during the attack, investigators found a magazine of a handgun that the intruder must have dropped during his haste escape. Detectives, however, discovered that the magazine had come from a stage gun, a Brixia 9mm handgun used commonly in theater productions. Although the intruder brandished the gun as if it were real, it was nothing more than a prop, and explained why all of his victims were stabbed with the dagger and not shot. Tragically, Amy's case is still open to this day. Over the years, detectives considered about a dozen potential suspects, but ultimately eliminated all of them. Investigators refuse to give up and hope that eventually someone will come forward and provide them with the information they need to press charges. People don't hitchhike now like they used to decades ago, for a good reason. Not only is it an unpredictable and often inefficient way to get around, but it can also be extremely dangerous. Getting into a car with a complete stranger on a long, lonely stretch of road isn't the wisest move. College students Lisa Eisman and Kim Vaccaro sadly found that out the hard way back in 1985. It was March, and Lisa and Kim just started their spring break. Both the young women lived in an off-campus apartment where they attended New York State University of Buffalo. 20-year-old Kim, the youngest of 8 children, grew up in Poughkeepsie and graduated from Arlington High School in 1982. She was a junior at Buffalo State, studying to be a social worker. Lisa, also 20 years old at the time, was a junior and was majoring in special education. The two friends discovered that the university was sponsoring a bus trip to Florida for spring break. However, they thought it would be more fun to hitchhike, so they made a plan to hitchhike down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Without informing their families and only telling a few friends, on March 29th, Kim and Lisa climbed into a tractor-trailer truck on the first leg of their journey to the Sunshine State, where they had agreed to meet a third roommate, Evelyn Berkowitz, 2 days later, on March 31st. By the next day, they had already made it all the way down to Hagerstown, Maryland, which is located near the Virginia border. There, they bought a postcard and mailed it off to a friend back home. Sadly, they were never seen or heard from again. The case got off to a slow start because nobody even knew they were missing for a few days. When they didn't show up to meet Evelyn on the 31st, she was alarmed, but also knew they'd been hitchhiking. So she waited a bit to see if the girls would turn up. But they never did. On April 2nd, in an undeveloped area, on an isolated stretch of the Hillsborough River, northeast of Tampa, a fisherman called into the Tampa Police Department reporting that about 400 yards west of the Interstate 75 bridge, a body, clothed in only a blue t-shirt, was floating in the water. The decomposed body was Lisa Eisman's. About 300 yards from that location, Kim Vaccaro's body was found, also only wearing a t-shirt. The women were not immediately identified. Lisa's father, Paul, had filed a missing persons report on his daughter after learning she had failed to arrive in Fort Lauderdale to meet Evelyn. Ultimately, dental records were used to confirm their identities. Forensic investigators discovered that the girls suffered blunt force trauma. The girls had been beaten on the face and head with a blunt instrument, but they couldn't determine much more from the decomposing bodies. Police officers speculated they were dumped over a nearby bridge, and that was as far as they ever got in the investigation. Evelyn told the police that she was completely against her friend's plan to hitchhike to Florida for spring break. She said that Lisa had assured her that everything was going to be okay, and even mentioned that she planned to arm herself with a kitchen knife for protection. Following his daughter's death, Paul began a campaign to warn college students of the danger of hitchhiking. He appeared on national television programs and spoke at numerous universities. No leads were ever uncovered in the case, and cops have been stumped ever since. Could Lisa and Kim have been victims of a serial killer or some other long-haul traveler along the way? Did they make it to Florida safe and sound only to be attacked, robbed, and murdered once there? Likely nobody will ever know for sure. I'd like to take a second to thank you for tuning into Horrific Nightmares. If you would like to support this channel, you can leave a comment below and hit the like button. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with anyone you know who may enjoy it as well. And if you already aren't, I hope you would consider subscribing to the channel so that you won't miss any of my upcoming episodes. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.